Let's get started and welcome in everyone. My name is Susan. I am a co-founder of the U of T Trash Team and program lead for volunteer engagement and community programs. And we're really excited to be able to introduce our second webinar, which is part of our larger series, looking at a selection of our pollution prevention projects. Over the course of this series, we've been covering each of the four topics you see here. Today, we're continuing with pre-production plastic pellets. We're going to share more details at the end of today's webinar on how to catch up on those previous, as well as how to join the upcoming ones. And next slide. So first, it's important for us to take a moment and recognize the lands on which we are gathering, and we acknowledge the diverse and unique groups of Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. In our local work and research, we acknowledge we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the William Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. There is a resource that many of you may be familiar with, and if not, we encourage you to have a look at a fantastic starting point, www.nativeland.ca, and I'll put that in the chat box right now for those of you. That link hopefully will work. So we'll move on to the next slide now. We're sure you're all keen to get started. Before we do want to learn a little bit more about you and what your motivations were for joining. So we'll just spend a few minutes. You can answer either or both of these questions, just letting us know who you're here representing today. And even more so, what are the motivations that brought you to join today's webinar? What types of things are you hoping to learn? So I'll pause for a moment as we welcome everyone to share of those joining us today. Okay, so now we have some answers coming through. I'll just read a few of them off, and we will keep those in mind as we go through the presentation and open up for Q&A later. So there's looking to learn more about our stormwater pollution prevention practices, design and fabrication elements, representative from Aqualis, who's really looking to learn a lot about pollution prevention. Chelsea of our team here is really sharing more of a personal experience and a lot of plastic that they saw in the ocean. We're from Pellets very far away. Great, so it looks like there's a good mix of individuals, researchers. We have some industry groups joining as well, some city groups and government. So there's a few here specifically interested in this topic, and then others looking to look at broader issues of pollution prevention and some examples. I'm just looking at the from York Region. That's really interesting that you were already looking into this issue prior to the pandemic. So it'll be great to speak with you following this presentation and any others as well. We will have our information. So this is great. Lots of great things here. Municipal, free plastic extras, great. So it seems like a great, interesting bunch, and we want to make sure that we have time to go through the presentation and be able to converse with all of you. So we'll move on to the next slide and introduce the topic and ourselves a little bit more. So before we do get back into today's topic, we just want to briefly introduce our organization to help contextualize this important research. We formed as the U of T Trash Team in 2017 in collaboration with the Rockman Lab at the University of Toronto, and we are a science-based community outreach organization with the shared goal to increase our waste literacy as a way to reduce plastic pollution. Next slide. The work that we do is supported by our large and dynamic team of volunteers and students and early career researchers, and led by our core staff members. And through our staff highlights our main work streams from solutions-based research, community outreach, and education, where myself, Chelsea, and Rafaela lead these areas of our work respectively. We also have Hannah on our organization who works alongside us in Ocean Conservancy on our international trash trap network, which also comes back into play when we discuss pellets. So all of the work that we do, our scientific evidence provides the foundation. Within our solutions-based research, we focus both upstream and downstream. Upstream for us refers to the sources of pollution, whereas downstream targets these items once they've become pollution. So we use our downstream solutions, which includes trash traps along the Toronto waterfront, and monitor different types of plastic pollution we find in Lake Ontario. The data from this research then helps inform our upstream work, otherwise known as our pollution prevention projects, each aimed at preventing plastic sources, different ones, from becoming plastic pollution. And so that brings us to today's webinar. We're talking about a very common item we find downstream, pre-production plastic pellets. Eden, who I'll turn it over to very soon, is the lead researcher of our Operation Sweep the Creek initiative and joins us today. She will be discussing the problem of these pellets leaking into local aquatic environments and share findings from this research, including a pilot to install pellet traps on the lots of local industries. And before I formally turn things over, we would like to thank and acknowledge that this research has been carried out with the collaboration and support of many, including the Ontario Ministry of Conservation and Parks, the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, EnviroPod International, Community Matters Toronto, Partners in Project Green, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. So I'd like to thank them all very much. And now, Eden, who is on the screen currently, I'll turn that over to you. So please welcome Eden to learn more.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure having you all here today. So thanks so much for joining us to learn more about our project on pre-production plastic pellets here in Toronto. As Susan mentioned, the goal of this webinar is to discuss all things plastic pellet pollution, from the problem all the way up to the solution. The webinar will begin with a short presentation from me, providing background on the issue and sharing the latest findings from our project, Operation Sweep the Creek. And then following this, we'll have time for you to ask me any questions you may have. Then we'll move on to our panel. I have prepared some questions for our panelists, but we'll also open up the floor for audience questions. So joining us today for our panel, we have three professionals who work within the field. So first is Mike Hanna, who is the co-founder and technical director of EnviroPod International. And EnviroPod International make the storm drain screen that we piloted in our study. So we've worked very closely with Mike over the past couple of years. Next, we have Shannon Laszlo, and Shannon is the manager of governance and member relations for the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada's Plastics Division, also for short, CIAC. And then all the way from Washington, D.C., we have Angela Noakes joining us, and Angela is a plastics policy analyst at the global environmental nonprofit Ocean Conservancy. So together, our three panelists share a wealth of knowledge in the world of plastics management and policy, and we really look forward to hearing their perspectives more on this issue. During our Q&As, so both my Q&A and our panelists' Q&A, you'll have the chance to ask questions both out loud or in the chat. In the meantime, if you have questions throughout the webinar, please add those to the chat, and if we can answer them right away, we'll respond there. If not, then we'll save them for our Q&A. Okay, so now we'll move on to hear more about the issue and our pilot. So pre-production plastic pellets, which are also commonly called nurdles, are the type of microplastic we're here to talk about today. Pre-production plastic pellets are the raw material that's used to make the plastic products that we use in everyday life. So from the plastic components in our cars, to our homes, to the containers that our food and our drinks come in at the grocery store, and everything in between. Plastic pellets come in a variety of colors and shapes and are usually the size of a lentil or smaller. Unfortunately, because of their small size and their light weight, plastic pellets are easily lost to the environment at each point along the plastic supply chain. So from their production to their storage and ultimately to their transportation to other facilities where plastic goods are made. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, estimates that in 2019, plastic pellets accounted for about 10% of total global microplastic emissions to the environment by weight. So the loss of plastic pellets can occur as a single event that releases a large mass directly to the environment. Examples of this include the 2021 Express Pearl cargo vessel disaster, which released an estimated 1,700 metric tons of plastic pellets into the ocean off of Sri Lanka's west coast. And closer to where I live, here in the Great Lakes region, in 2008, a train carrying plastic pellet cargo derailed in northwestern Ontario, releasing plastic pellets into Lake Superior and resulting in plastic pellet pollution on the lake's north shore, evidence of which can still be seen today. But more commonly, the loss of plastic pellets occurs as a subtle, continuous release during the day-to-day operations of the plastics industry. In this case, if the spilled plastic pellets are not cleaned up promptly and adequately, they can be picked up by rain and snowmelt and washed into the stormwater sewer system, where direct release to local rivers and creeks is likely. And this subtle, continuous loss of plastic pellets to the environment is exactly the scenario that our project, Operation Sweep the Creek, is working to address here in the Greater Toronto Area. So these pictures that I'm sharing on the slide are actually from some of the companies that we have been working with in Toronto over the past few years. So Operation Sweep the Creek first began in 2019, and it's a multi-phase collaborative project which includes government and industry partners. It follows the typical pollution prevention project recipe. So the first step being to better understand the problem, followed by trialing doing a small scale trial of a solution, and then finally trying to scale up the solution for broader impact, all done to inform positive change. So for context here, on this project specifically, the Canadian plastics industry is concentrated in Southern Ontario. And as a result, many studies have documented the presence of plastic pellets on shorelines and in rivers and creeks in the Great Lakes region. This was first reported in the scientific literature in 2011, so over 10 years ago, when researchers observed plastic pellets along Lake Huron's shoreline near the properties of plastics companies. And then in 2018, these same researchers out of Western University did a larger scale assessment of plastic pellet pollution across Great Lakes beaches, and they found that 64% of the beaches they surveyed had plastic pellets. The researchers produced the figure that I'm showing on the slide, and you can identify red hotspots of pollution in this figure. So on Lake Superior's North Shore, at the top of the figure, you can see the location where the train derailed in 2008 that I mentioned earlier. And then you can also see hotspots in Sarnia, on the southern tip of Lake Huron, and Toronto in the western tip of Lake Ontario. And these, of course, are where lots of plastics companies are located in Ontario. So ultimately, these studies that report the presence of plastic pellets in the Great Lakes environment, as well as our trash team's own work on the Toronto Harbourfront that Susan mentioned in her introduction, these are really the things that motivated our team to start this project on plastic pellets. So I'll briefly share the results of phases 1 and 2, and then I'll move on to our new findings that have just come out of our third phase. So phase 1 was led by Nick Su, who is a MSc graduate from the Rockman Lab. And as I mentioned, the goal of phase 1 was to better understand patterns in local contamination. So Nick went out and measured plastic pellets in Mimico Creek, which is a tributary just to the west of Toronto. Mimico Creek's watershed is 98% urbanized and is home to many plastics companies, so it made a very relevant case study. In the field, Nick observed an increase in plastic pellets during wet events compared to dry events, which really demonstrated the importance of stormwater as a transport pathway for plastic pellets. So as I mentioned before, once spills happen, if they're not cleaned up fast, then it rains and that brings everything into the sewer system. And then after conducting outreach to share our findings with local plastic companies, our team started phase 2. And phase 2 was really led by EnviroPod. And the goal here was to trial a potential solution. So we started a pilot project with a plastic packaging manufacturer to show proof of concept of storm drain screens in preventing spilled plastic pellets that are carried by rain or snowmelt from escaping facility boundaries. You can see an example of what a storm drain screen looks like in the top right corner of the slide. So essentially, these screens work by trapping plastic pellets that are traveling in rain or snowmelt, effectively preventing them from entering the stormwater sewer system. In phase 2, we installed 5 storm drain screens on the company's property and then collected, counted, and weighed the captured plastic pellets over the course of a year. And by the end of the pilot project, the 5 storm drain screens captured nearly 35,000 plastic pellets, which demonstrated that they are an effective tool that can be used to address this problem. So this brings us on to phase 3, which is the current phase of Operation Sweep the Creek. And as I mentioned, the goal of phase 3 was to assess the scalability of storm drain screens as a solution to plastic pellet loss. So for phase 3, we moved from the Mimico Creek watershed to the Humber River watershed, and we partnered with 5 plastic companies, some of which produce plastic pellets and others who manufacture plastic goods from plastic pellets produced elsewhere. We installed a total of 13 storm drain screens across their properties, monitored them again for over a year, and then we interviewed the plastic companies to better understand their experiences using this tool. So the pictures on the slide show you a bit of what this process looked like from the field into the lab. So on the left-hand side, you can see what a storm drain screen looks like when it's installed and working. In the middle, this is what some of the screens looked like when we pulled them out to empty them. So clearly trapping lots of plastic pellets among other debris. And then on the right-hand side, this is what it looked like in the lab when we subsampled our pellet samples to make it more feasible to count and weigh everything and get final tallies. So in terms of our monitoring results, all in all, our 13 storm drain screens across the 5 plastic companies captured just shy of 5.5 million plastic pellets over the course of the year, which is of course much more than we would have predicted given our findings from phase 2. And as would be expected, the number of plastic pellets varied across companies, storm drain screens, and times. There's lots of factors that I think play into the numbers we actually saw, and we didn't really dig into those more. And then in terms of, after monitoring for a year, we were able to conduct exit interviews with 4 of the 5 companies that participated. And we asked them a variety of questions, some about their efforts made to address the issue before joining our project, and then others about their experience using storm drain screens during our project, and if their participation in the project has influenced any of their future management plans. So in terms of what they said, before joining our project, half of the companies were already doing something to address plastic pellet loss and half were not. Of the 2 that were doing something, a few of them had very simple mesh screens that they had put into storm drain screens themselves, but these were very, very simple, just a screen that required almost weekly maintenance. So very different from the traps that we piloted. And then others had very informal protocols around cleaning up spills, but no formal protocols in place. When asked, all of the companies said that they found the storm drain screens to be a practical and effective solution to plastic pellet loss, and none of them experienced any significant barriers in continuing to maintain the screens after taking over from our team. So we last attended the sites in November of last year, and since then, the companies have been continuing to upkeep the traps themselves. We also asked them if they had any plans to expand their use of storm drain screens. One company this was not applicable to because they only had 1 storm drain on their property, so they had nowhere else to put new screens. But the other 3 said no, they did not. And the nuance here is that a lot of these companies sit under larger umbrella organizations. And so they were still in the process of feeding the findings up the food chain to management at the umbrella organization. So I don't think those conversations of expanding their use had occurred yet. But the silver lining of that is potentially, although we only work with 5 companies, the reach of this project is a lot greater, given a lot of these companies live within larger umbrella organizations that have more companies across Canada, the US, and broader. So in terms of the U of T trash streams policy recommendations that are coming out of this project, we think the Government of Ontario should consider creating a regulation under the Environmental Protection Act that requires plastic companies that handle pre-production resin, which includes pellets as well as scrap and powder, to deploy and maintain storm drain screens with a 1 millimeter liner in all stormwater drains on their properties. This is very similar to bills that have recently been proposed in Ontario to do the same on washing machines to capture microfibers being shed from clothing. So it's the same idea, source prevention by trapping. And then we also suggest that the government offers financial assistance for small and medium-sized enterprises for the procurement, installation, and maintenance of the storm drain screens. We worked with some mom and pop shops that have only a handful of employees on this project, and I know financial assistance in getting this up and running would be extremely beneficial for these companies. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I welcome any questions from the audience at this time. So you're welcome to type them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can say them out loud.
Eden, you've got a couple questions. I don't know if you can see one from Leah Leon from the city of Toronto.
Yes, Leah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much. I was just curious, and I don't think I heard anything about this, but has there ever been any kind of look into what can be done with the plastic pellets once they're collected? Do they all just, necessarily kind of end up in the trash, or is that totally outside of the scope?
No, that's a great question. And that's actually one of the surprising things that came out of my interviews is some of the companies are actually recycling them. So they're
Okay.
bringing them back into their facility, putting them, cleaning them and putting them into their recycling machine where I think they regrind them and create a new type of scrap. But of course, that's only if they aren't too dirty with other gunk that inevitably ends up in the storm drain screen. So one of
Yeah,
the
I can imagine it wouldn't be so pretty.
Exactly. So one of the companies actually told me that they try to make an effort to go out more frequently than is even needed based on, capacity of the trap and flooding potential. So they try to go out more frequently to capture these pellets before they get really dirty so they can reuse them.
Thanks.
Of course. Payne M, you can go ahead as well. Oh, I might have to unmute you. Oh, there you go. You're unmuted. Go ahead. Oh, I can't hear you. You are unmuted. I can't. Maybe while you set up your audio there, we'll just go to a question in the chat. So Barry from EnviroPod asked, has this data been shared with government policymakers? So not yet. Great question, Barry. We're actually in the process of putting together a one-page policy brief. And we will be sending that out to everyone who attended the webinar in a few days. And then we'll also be sharing it with provincial government here in Ontario as well.
Eden, I'm just looking at the chat. Oh, you might have noticed that at the same time as me, there's
Yes.
questions in there.
Is the city of Toronto involved? So I don't, the city of Toronto hasn't been involved with Operation Sweep the Creek that's been specific to plastic pellets, but the city of Toronto does partner with the U of T trash team using these storm drain screens downtown on the waterfront for broader types of debris and trash, not just pellets, but they weren't involved in this project. And can private condo properties use this process? That's a good question. I actually don't know if there are implications for private properties and storm drains and if a condo could themselves purchase and maintain a storm drain screen. I assume possibly if it's on their property, given that the plastic companies are doing the same, but I'm not too sure. But these traps are used for, as I mentioned, many more different types of trash and debris, not just pellets. So there is applications that go much further than just this one type of microplastic in this source.
Just a little further up, Barry was wondering about the data itself, if it's being shared with, I'm sorry, I just lost the government policymakers.
Yes, yeah, yes. and it will not yet, but it will be soon when after we get our policy brief fully drafted, and we'll share it with everyone here and then also send it out to the relevant governments. And many municipalities have sewer use bylaws that cover storm drain sewers and can be used to encourage industries to use their screens. Yes, I think our policy brief, we wanted to target the provincial government rather than the municipalities, so that the provincial government can maybe set a standard or a guideline that then feeds down to municipalities who do have the bylaws in place to manage stormwater pollution and prevention. We ourselves haven't approached any municipalities, but as I mentioned, we're trying to go provincial first, so that in the hopes that that then feeds down to municipalities within Ontario. Oh, there you go. And Mike from EnviroPod popped in and said that private site use of storm drain screens is generally okay. So they've had lots of experience using their screens across different types of industries and sectors. So Mike says it's generally okay. We have 2 more minutes, so if anybody has any other questions, you're welcome to sneak them in, and then we'll move to our panel. Well, that's good to know that the City of Calgary had some good success through their sewer use bylaw. Okay, so I think we'll move on to our panel unless anybody has any other burning questions. Okay, so I'd like to bring in, yes, our panelists now to join the conversation. So panelists, you're welcome to turn your cameras on and unmute yourselves. Before we dive into questions for our panelists, I'll get them to briefly introduce themselves. I gave you their job titles and their organizations before, but if they could give us maybe a little bit more about how they're involved in this issue. So let's start with Mike. Mike, you can go first. If you can give us a little bit of a background on how you're connected to this issue, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, I'm Mike Hanna. I'm the Technical Director of EnviroPod International, and since 1995, I've been looking in stormwater drains and looking at the ocean and the harbour where I lived, and have been particularly concerned about the connection they have from the land to the ocean. And so for over 30 years, we've been trying to find solutions, simple solutions to help the landowners stop stuff going into the ocean.
Thanks, Mike. And next we'll move on to Shannon. Shannon, if you could introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Shannon Laszlo. I have the privilege of leading OCS initiative here in Canada, the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, the Plastics Division, or CICPD, holds the trademark here in Canada. And for those of you who might not be familiar, Operation Clean Sweep is an international program. It's based on preventing environmental issues. It helps plastic resin manufacturers and handlers improve their housekeeping and resin containment practices. And it supports the mission to eliminate the plastic resin loss in the environment.
Thanks, Shannon. And Angela, last but not least.
Hi, I'm Angela Noakes. I'm a plastics policy analyst at Ocean Conservancy. And my role here is to focus on state and federal policy solutions to prevent plastic pollution, including from plastic pellets. So thanks for having me here today.
Okay, excellent. Thank you all. I am just going to get my questions up. So as I mentioned, I'll start with some questions that I've already prepared in advance, and then we'll open the floor to the audience. So Mike, I'll start with a question for you. So for nearly 30 years, your company has been developing solutions for stormwater pollutants. Can you tell us a bit about when and how you first realized that plastic pollution with a focus on plastic pellets was a critical part of the stormwater management issue?
Cool. So yeah, back in 1995, being a keen diver and surfer and everything, and concerned about what was in the ocean, we started putting, me and a few friends, started putting bags and drains, just really to have a look at stormwater pollution. It was quite new at the time, and we wanted to know, well, how much is coming through those stormwater drains. And we were really amazed with the amount of gross pollutants, trash, plastics, plastic bottles, cigarette butts that were coming through the drains. And at the time, it was really thought that gross pollutants and plastics were just an aesthetic, a visual problem. It was thought, well, this is non-toxic, it's not going to hurt anyone. There was no garbage patch back then either. And it was like, whoa, hold it. We're catching over 1,000 pieces of macroplastics in each one of these bags, a year. And so this cannot be insignificant. So that's how we got into really wanting to address, the macro plastic pollution coming from a stormwater area. We were actually trying to capture sediment and heavy metals and realized, hold it, there's all this other stuff that's just being overlooked. As far as plastic pellets came, well, that would have been about over 10 years ago, and we were actually contacted by the New Zealand plastics industry. I'm based in New Zealand, but Enviropod International is a global company. We sell our products all over the world. And we're approached by the New Zealand plastics industry, a guy called Simon Wilkinson, who was a consultant working for the plastics industry in New Zealand. And he was going around offering members of OCS, or the plastics industry, free audits on their sites, going through how to best manage the pellets, how to stop them being lost. And if you did lose them, where would they go? They go down this drain, and where does that drain go? And he was really educating them. And so he approached us with, can you do anything in these drains? And we said, yeah, for sure. We've got something for those drains. And so we've started a great relationship with the New Zealand plastics industry, and we've done nearly most of their members with them. We're only one part of the solution, and I think that's why it works so well with the audit and a member of the association working with individual members to get the solutions in. So that's how I became aware of pellets, and then I now find them on every beach I go to in the world. I can look around in the sand.
Yeah. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. But thank you, Mike. You set my next question up perfectly. You were talking about the New Zealand Plastics Industry Association, and of course, Shannon's here from the Canadian equivalent. And my next question was for Shannon about how CIAC works with its members to help implement these best management practices for preventing resin loss. And of course, Mike alluded that these storm drain screens are just one tool. There's other tools that I know are in the box. So Shannon, can you tell us about kind of the toolkit that you guys help your members implement?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a number of things that we do to help members. First, when they decide to commit to OCS, we provide a variety of resources to help them get started. There's practical guidelines, training materials, and then an onboarding session where they have the opportunity to ask questions they might have. Our goal is to make sure that they smoothly integrate OCS best practices into their daily operations. Once they've been onboarded, we have them start reporting. We've developed a comprehensive checklist of best practices that all members must submit quarterly. These assessments are mandatory, and they kind of just help everyone ensure that they're following the guidelines. And the assessments help keep us all on track and highlight areas for improvement so our members can take proactive steps to enhance their operations. We're big on promoting a culture of continuous improvement by encouraging our members to track their progress and share success stories, what works for them, what doesn't. And we feel it fosters accountability and builds a community where everyone could learn from one another. And then we just maintain open communication to address any challenges in real time and adapt any strategies as needed.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So Shannon kind of gave us a view of some measures industry are taking, and Angela, you kind of have more of an understanding of measures governments may be taking. So unlike Canada, in the US, there are some some policies that are enacted, but others that have been proposed specific to plastic pellets. So can you tell us about these policies, and if you believe that there's any other policies that could or would be helpful in addressing this issue that currently aren't on the table?
Thanks. As far as I know, California is the only US state that has directly regulated plastic pellet pollution, which it did through AB 258 in 2007. California's law regulates pre-production plastic through waste discharge, monitoring, and reporting requirements, along with implementing best practices. And it applies to facilities that manufacture, handle, or transport plastics. Other states have tried to pass bills after pellet spills, but they haven't been successful. Currently, the US doesn't have a federal policy that specifically addresses plastic pellets. We do have the Clean Water Act, which regulates the discharge of pollutants into US waterways, but so far pellets haven't been directly regulated through that law. At Ocean Conservancy, we do believe that additional policy is needed to address pollution from plastic pellets. Legislation's been pending in the US Congress for the past several years, called the Plastic Pellet Free Waters Act, and this bill would require the US Environmental Protection Agency to issue a regulation that prohibits the discharge of plastic pellets and other pre-production plastics into waterways of the United States using its Clean Water Act authority. EPA already has the authority to do this, but it hasn't. And so this bill is a way for Congress to direct the EPA to take action and do what they've successfully been doing for so many other harmful pollutants since the 1970s.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for those explanations. So Shannon, if we jump back to you then, can I ask you what participation in Operation Clean Sweep looks like across Canada? So I know it used to be a voluntary program. There has been a recent change. So you can tell us about that. And then maybe can you talk to us about what CIAC does to try to get more companies to join the industry association and then partake in the program?
Absolutely. So currently, like you said, OCS, we've made it mandatory for all our members at the CIAC PD, and it is available exclusively to them. This just ensures consistent commitment among participants and promotes the best practices in handling resin pellets. By making membership a requirement, we feel we're building a community of leaders who are passionate about the program's future and dedicated to enhancing the practices. To enhance our efforts even further, we introduced a transportation partner category. Transportation partners are companies involved in the logistics of moving the plastic resin pellets. So they play a key role in making sure that the plastic pellets are handled and transported and delivered safely and responsibly. By collaborating with these companies, we're establishing a comprehensive approach to plastic resin loss throughout the supply chain. And then in addition to these initiatives, we're continuously exploring ways to expand our outreach of OCS and highlights that's important to all the industry. Through workshops, training sessions, accessible resources, we aim to support and encourage greater participation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mike, we'll jump back to you for the next question. Can you talk about some of the challenges of managing plastic pellets as a stormwater pollutant in contrast to other types of stormwater pollutants that exist and that have to be managed?
Sure. It's probably the three factors. There's the density, the size of them, and the pure volume of pellets that are being transported and used. Now, usually we're trying with stormwater pollutants, we're trying to capture sediments and particle pollutants attached to them, and they're quite heavy. A bit of gravel, a bit of dirt is quite heavy. The density of pellets is pretty much almost the same as water. Some pellets, depending on the type of plastic, slightly heavier, some are slightly lighter. And that means it's fluid like water. If you drop it, it takes off. If you try to sweep it with a broom, it runs away. It rolls into every little crevice. And when it rains, it's quite really easy to be mobilized and transported. And it doesn't necessarily transport on the surface of the water, something because of the movement and the actions of the water. It's often transported in the water column, which means it's really hard to settle out or even separate. So you really need to screen it in some sort of way. The size, 1 to 3 millimeters, that's small, but it's not as small as most stormwater contaminants. Usually we're talking 1 millimeter, so it's a larger pollutant. But then also the sheer volume you have of these. One rail cart, which a manufacturing silo will produce in an hour, has 100 million metric ton, which is literally trillions and trillions of plastic. And these are being produced 24/7. I've spent a bit of time in Texas and the oil plants there where they make it. And it's just the volume. And you know that from all the plastic we have in our lives, we need that volume. So that amount of volume being transported and moved is also a real challenge with it. So those three things make it difficult to manage. If you are putting in interventions to capture it, there's a potential that you will have a lot of pellets that you've got to deal with because they're hard to manage. So you need to be able to empty and maintain quickly, and the interception must have to have the capacity to make sure it captures all of them and hold them safely without like resuspending them and losing them in a bigger event as well. So it's different to other stormwater contaminants, and very challenging, even though looks rather simple.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Angela, I have one last question for you before I ask you all one final question. So you mentioned that the U.S. has some policies in place, well, one policy in place, others in development. Here in Canada, we have none. Is there something Canada can learn from the U.S. in terms of moving forward with a regulation on plastic pellets?
Yeah, I think both Canada and the US can learn lessons from efforts that have been undertaken so far to address this issue. We've known that plastic pellets are a major problem for decades, and so far voluntary initiatives haven't been able to meet the scale of change that's needed. California's law and the Plastic Pellet Free Waters Act are both examples of how policy can move us beyond voluntary action and create mandatory requirements for managing this pollution. And they also show how existing environmental protections can address this problem. In the US, we've been regulating pollutants in waterways for decades using the Clean Water Act. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel when there's laws in place that could help address this issue, but we do need to update how we implement them to reflect the seriousness of plastic pollution.
Thank you. Okay, so my last question for all of you, and I think, Angela, you kind of hinted at this in your response there. Compared to other sources of plastic pollution, of which there are many, plastic pellets kind of seems like low-hanging fruit, yet it remains an unresolved issue. So we have tools like these screens that work really well to prevent these pellets from leaking, but of course, their use is what matters the most. So from each of your perspectives, what needs to happen for us to make substantial progress on this matter here in Ontario, in Canada, or even beyond? And if you guys can, keep it really, really short so then we can get to our audience Q&A as well. But just like a little tidbit on your perspective on that question. Shannon, go ahead, you can start.
Okay, great question, and I will keep it short. I think first, enhancing collaboration across the industry supply chain is vital. We need to bring together manufacturers, processors, and distributors to share best practices and maintain the protocols for handling the plastic pellets throughout production. Regulatory support is essential. Advocating for stronger regulations to mandate effective containment measures can make a big difference. Education and awareness also plays a critical role. Many companies don't fully grasp the impact of resin loss or the best practices to address it. Offering targeted training programs and resources can empower employees at all levels to make informed decisions. And then lastly is just innovation. It's key. We have to continue to encourage the development of new technology and processes that can minimize pellet loss.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. That was a really comprehensive answer. I appreciate that. Angela, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'd add that, there are so many sources of microplastics out there, and this is an issue that has the people's attention. It seems like every week there's a new report of another place that microplastics have been found. So I think we need to act on this new research, but we also can't lose sight of these low-hanging opportunities that can significantly improve environmental outcomes. So we do need increased commitment from policymakers to address this issue. And to get there, I think we need to bring more attention to the harm that these pellets cause, the current gaps in policy that's letting this to continue, and lessons learned from efforts that are already underway.
Excellent, thanks. And Mike, last word to you before our audience Q&A.
I think there needs to be greater enforcement and, dare I say, regulations. Obviously, the Clean Waters Act, you can't discharge pollutants, and the Fisheries Act in Canada too. We can't discharge anything that's going to affect fish. There are the regulations there, but we're not really getting an uptake. As I said, we work with plastics industries, and their members are really good, but there's a whole bunch of people not part of the plastics industries that run, free cowboys out there doing whatever they want, so and it's really hard for the people that are doing the right thing, and then you've got others not doing anything and not having to pay any costs or address their costs. So better enforcement is what I think about around the issue, education, awareness, and those who are not doing the right thing being really forcefully encouraged to do the right thing. So, yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so now we will move on to our audience Q&A. So just a reminder for our audience, you can type things into the chat. You're welcome to also raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask your question. If your question is for one of our panelists in particular, if you can just let us know who you'd like to direct the question to, that would be great. So feel free to start typing things into the chat or raising your hands. So this one looks like it's for Angela. So did California see much improvement when they passed their legislation, and who enforces it?
I believe it's enforced through the State Water Quality Control Board. And I haven't been able to find data exactly on improvement there, but I have seen examples of enforcement actions that the state of California has taken to enforce this law and leading to cleanup and changes in practices.
I could add to that.
Oh, sure, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, they've got very strict on all sorts of trash and plastic pollution. They are, by 2030, nearly it's illegal to discharge any trash to the stormwater drains from high priority areas. And the plastic legislation has been part of that, addressing plastic pollution, and they've gone back to existing stormwater permits. So everyone must have a discharge permit for stormwater in California, which ties into a regional permit, and they opened up those old permits to go, okay, we've got this information on a new pollutant, now you must address it, and gave them a window of time, 3 years, I think, to find the best solution to address their loss, or put in implementation, put in capture measures, and that's how it's got going. So they're quite advanced. Nearly every industrial site has a permit for discharge of stormwater.
Okay, thank you, Mike, for adding. Okay, Chelsea, you have your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sorry, I can't help myself. And so it's a question for Shannon, and it's possible you alluded to this and I missed it because I've been watching the waiting room and doing all the spotlighting. But I'm curious, if a policy is put in place by the government, how do you see the OCS program, which is a wonderful program, interweaving with that, right? So both can exist at the same time.
Well, I don't work on the policy team. Our VP works with policymakers. So I can't answer that question to the best of my ability, but I believe we would do our best to work together with the goal where we all have the same goal at the end.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. A bit ago, we were talking to CIAC quite a bit as they were discussing policies in Ontario, and we were discussing ways to make it overlap, which was nice, so that the tools that exist and the lessons learned carried into that type of regulation, and there was still collaboration. So I didn't know if there was any follow-up on that. Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Any other questions? We have about 3 more minutes left for audience Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to write it in the chat or raise your hand and unmute yourself. And maybe I'll ask a question in the meantime. So Mike, you mentioned EnviroPod is global. How many different countries now are there litter traps installed and working?
There was well, Canada, USA, New Zealand, Australia. A couple of demos in Singapore and Malaysia, and we're in the negotiations with the Middle East with a company in there to look at representing it through there. In some of the more developing countries, they don't even have drains. They just have big ditches on the side, so they have you can't just put a storm drain screen in there. They've got different challenges. But as they build new factories, there's opportunities to put more of a controlled or managed stormwater system in.
Thank you. We had one more question come up in the chat. So have you ever received any pushback from companies or industries from certain pollution prevention practices or policies? Who would that be for? Pushback from companies or industries? So I guess maybe that's a question for CIAC. Have there been any companies that you guys have worked with that have had certain practices within the guidebook say they don't want to do this, but they're happy to do another one?
We've had some pushback regarding the assessments that we implemented. I think they frightened some people, and really it is just a set of guidelines for best practices. Some of our members got concerned that it would become more involved or fines might be imposed. So there's a lot of educating involved, where there's a fear of them getting into trouble or something like that. And they say we keep it, we do a best practices, but we don't want to report on it. And this fear is not a great thing. We need to be open. We need to learn from each other's mistakes. And so there's a lot of education going on behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mike, I think this question is perfect for you. Other than plastic pellets, have there been other pollutants these screens have been used to trap? So can you talk a bit about what other pollutants you guys target with litter traps?
Yeah, we are targeting the larger fraction of pollutants, as I said, but that being said, we have different performance liners we put on our screens. So we can catch from 200 micron, which we use for powder. There's not only pellets in making plastic products, there's powder, there's flake. So we often use the 1,000 for the 200 micron for powder and flake, and then 1,000 micron for the pellets, and then the standard basket or screen is a 5mm holes in and that's because the regulations is around 5mm holes, and so we capture everything above 5mm, and that's considered trash in California and other states, or gross pollutants. We also catching all the leaves is an important factor, because a big problem we have in Canada is that too much phosphorus in the lake, especially shallow lakes that get warm. So while we don't think leaves are a pollutant, if they're washing off hard surfaces and into drains, they become a pollutant when they break down in the lake. So these larger pollutants are also, larger particles also have other pollutants associated with them. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, thanks for that answer. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of our panel. So I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. It's been really great to hear all of your perspectives from different sectors and industries. So thank you again for joining us and chatting today. And now we'll just move on to our last slide, and then I'll welcome Susan to come back up and then wrap up the webinar.
Yes, that was great. So many great discussion points and questions, and kind of brings us to a nice segue to thank everyone so much, our incredible speakers, for sharing their time with us today. And we still have 2 additional sources of plastic pollution that we'll explore over the next few months. Coming up next is wet wipes on November 14th and construction foam at December 3rd. That webinar will be the same time as our first one at 12 o'clock noon Eastern Standard Time. If you're already registered, you don't need to do anything else. If you haven't and you'd like to join, it's the same Eventbrite link. And we will have a recording from today's webinar. And I did want to loop back to a question that came up in terms of the use of those pellets. Now, not everyone would be able to do this, but Chesley will put a link in the chat. One of our researchers on the project actually seeked out an external grant, and she created a whole stop motion movie talking about pellets called Life of a Pellet. So it was a really great way to use this material in an educational and awareness way. So we definitely encourage everyone to have a peek at her short stop motion film. It was really incredible. We just premiered it last week, so very timely question. And on that note, I would like to thank you so much for joining us today, and we too encourage you to stay in touch. All of our information is on the screen, and we welcome you to email us if you have any future questions. So thanks again so much, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Awesome.